Notoriously criticised for their role in the ever-growing housing crisis, we asked today's guest whether landlords have really earned their reputation.
We speak to Alex Morris, who started Let's Move to make property work for everyone.
We ask Alex whether being a landlord really is as lucrative as the media makes it out to be, and whether there are lesser-known challenges behind being a landlord that we don't hear about.
This episode is a must listen for anyone who's ever found themselves wondering why our rental market is such a mess. Alex, it is so great to have you here. Welcome onto the podcast. And I'd love to start off by asking you about landlords and property owners, because you are working with them all day, every day, and they have a pretty bad reputation. Why do you think it is that they have such a bad reputation? And do you think they really deserve it?
I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to this. So it's the first thing to point out. I'm a landlord myself, but I've also been a tenant. Most landlords were tenants at some point. I'll start with the first part of the question. So why do I think landlords and property owners get such a bad rep? The easy answer is the volumes of them. So there's about 2.5 million landlords in the UK.
Wow.
And if you come at this from a political point of view or from a media point of view, it's about who's going to read the article or who's potentially going to vote for you in the next election. And do you service those 2.5 million landlords or the 12 million tenants that are living in rented properties? So the first thing is they're an easy target. So that's why they get a bad press.
Sure.
Whether they deserve it or not, I mean, I'm all pro-landlord. I think they provide a much-needed resource of housing, especially in the situation that we have now where social housing just has not grown to the level it needs to, and the private residential sector is filling that gap. And a lot of them, more than 90% of them, provide good quality housing. And they do so, and it's a passion for them rather than a money-making scheme. And of course there's going to be people in there wanting to make money, but so it's a difficult one. It is a business at the end of the day. And we find when I speak to landlords, you'll get a full spectrum. You'll get a hardcore, just in it to make the money. Whether or not they make money on a regular monthly basis versus something that they might make in capital gains down the line is different to the press perception that there's some rich guy in a mansion somewhere who owns like 90% of all properties that are rented and they're all really rubbish properties. It just isn't the case. So I am really pro-landlord. They don't deserve the bad press that they get. The ones that do deserve it are the bad landlords, and then they make up a really tiny percentage of all the landlords and all of the property that's out there. If you compared the PRS with the social sector, the shocking statistics of the quality of housing in the social sector compared to the private sector, and we just don't talk about it. And in fact, when we talk about social sector housing quality, it's usually grouped with the private sector. So you'll get a press article that says landlord failed, and there's been a recent one with the mould, failed to resolve a mould issue, and tragic circumstances. But they won't establish the fact that that's a social landlord. That wasn't a private landlord. But it's another avenue for the attack on the whole sector. And so two answers there. One, they get it because they're an easy target, and two, no, they don't deserve it. For the majority of them, definitely don't deserve it. So
and I think you touched on it there, but what I'd be super interested to know is being a landlord as profitable as it is made out to be in the press? Because we're seeing so many stories as well at the moment. There is obviously a housing shortage across the country, particularly in cities, and rental prices are going through the roof in London, especially where I live, and lots of tenants are seeing their landlords put up rates. And I think people are confused a bit as to whether this is necessary, because there's a perception in the media that landlords just make loads of money all the time.
So I'm going to touch on Let's Move, the platform that we've just built, is all to address that issue, basically. I've been in this industry for over 20 years, and I could probably count on these hands the number of landlords who are really in tune with what it is that they're making. Most of them don't have a clue. Yeah, they'll get to the end of the tax year. You'll get phone calls at the beginning of January with panic to, oh my God, I need my statements and all of this, because you get them monthly, but then, you know, who has time to go and manually put them in a spreadsheet? And so the whole point of Let's Move that we built was to allow landlords to have a look at what they're making on a regular basis and predict what they could potentially make over the next 12 months or lose. I suppose one of the myths around the rental sector, landlords pay tax on the entirety of their rental income. So it's not a profit-led thing. And so there are certain deductible expenses that they can put through that. And since the removal of the mortgage interest tax relief, that's become a lot more difficult for them to understand.
Could you just explain a little bit
I'll
there?
try.
What happened there?
So a few years ago, I think it's Section 24, brought in a regulation that requires landlords to no longer deduct the interest that they pay on their mortgages from the rental income that they receive before they pay tax. It was scaled in. So it was like slowly built up. Now I'm fairly certain that there's no relief, which is why you've seen a bit of a jump in landlords moving to companies to register properties, because it is permitted there, but there's a number of pros and cons to doing something like that, because it's about your personal circumstances, because your tax might be eroded somewhere else with capital gains.
Got you.
So much more, you've got to be very savvy, and the best advice you'd give is go and sit with someone and really understand whether or not that's the path for you, because it might not be, and paying your tax might just be the best answer. Now, what it did for a lot of landlords is it pushed them from a 20% bracket into the 40% bracket, which was the biggest, like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? And I don't think there was enough motivation from the government to sort of notify landlords of that change. There definitely was a big gap in the learning piece about this is coming down the line. And accountants get a bad rep because they didn't have the time or the resources to contact everybody on their books and say, this is happening, this is coming, prepare. But then you get the shock, oh my God, I'm going to have to sell. Knee-jerk reactions. The truth is that on its own, I don't think has had a huge impact on the number of properties that are in the market. I think the majority of people have just found ways to cope with it. So it's a really complicated answer. But no, landlords don't make tons and tons of money on a regular basis out of renting properties. Some of them don't even cover their mortgages because you've got the rise of the accidental landlords. I'd say semi-professional and professional landlords do make money because they are running it as a business. But what are we talking here? There's a good 30 to 40% of the entire market just have one extra property.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's like, it's your doctor, your mum, your dad, your auntie, they've split up with someone, moved somewhere else, gone to work somewhere else, and couldn't sell their house or didn't want to sell their house, and they've therefore
rented. Is this why you're getting this rise of accidental landlords?
Accidental landlords has been the largest rising sector for the past 15 years.
Wow. Really?
And I'd say you can probably directly link it to the last property crash that we had of 2007, 2008. But you are seeing a decline of those now because property prices have caught up. Equity's looking really good. So they are now able to get offload those accidental properties. But a number of those did actually end up starting to buy further ones because they realised there was some benefit to it. They were the ones that were most likely to lose money. And, I'm not going to... ultimately, if you are a landlord, and whether you get into it accidentally or not, you've got a responsibility.
For sure.
Provide a good quality house. It's not an excuse for you to say, well, I can't afford to fix the boiler because I'm not even covering my mortgage payments.
No.
You shouldn't be getting into it if that's the case.
Yeah.
And I do fully sympathise with people that bought properties at the height of the last boom and then couldn't sell them as a result of the crash. But these are the repercussions of those things. If you don't want to lose money in the sale of that asset and you rent it out, then you're going to have to stomach the costs of what's involved with renting it out. So there's probably a good 40% of landlords that make a profit on a monthly basis.
That's not that high.
No, it's not as high as people think it is.
No, not at all.
And I think we looked at the last HMRC issued a report saying, given the geographical locations of all the landlords in the UK that have declared property income on their tax returns, and if you have a look at the history of tweaks and changes in regulations, the financial, the HMRC, the tax, the reporting, it seems to me that the objective they have is to try and find out who's a landlord and also get all of that income declared, because there's quite a lot of people who didn't even know they needed to declare it as income. Big shock horror. Guess how many landlords in the industry don't use an accountant? I think that's probably another big... please get an accountant. It's a really useful tool when you're trying to navigate the perils of HMRC. And then there's lots of tweaks and changes that have come. So I think we looked at mortgage statistics recently. And the mortgage statistics told us that there are probably around 25% rise in the number of mortgages that are being requested through companies. And purchases that are being done through companies. So clearly for a lot of people, after taking advice, I hope, registering a company and purchasing properties through a company means that they've got more control over what they make out of it.
I've definitely seen a big rise. I work in finance, and I definitely have seen a big rise in people who want to buy properties first, setting up a company and doing it that way.
It's just, there are perils, you'll know, won't you? It's like, you've got to think about your corporation tax, that, are you offsetting anything really when you come to corporation tax? Mortgages are harder to get. Interest rates generally are higher.
The fees of running the actual business costs.
Your tax return, your accountant's fees, all of that increases. They're not going to be. I think what you'll find is that that's for the top 40% of landlords, those that own 5 or more properties. And we're also finding quite diverse portfolio holdings now as well. So might own 8 properties, 3 under a company, 2 under a personal name, 2 with your partner or family members. And a lot of that I don't think is strategic. The more latter stages of it is probably strategic. The earlier stages are more symptomatic of the circumstances they found themselves in. And therefore, that it tells this tale of the way the demographic of landlords has changed. So I sometimes go rambling, and I hope I'm making sense, because
everything
really
you say makes complete sense. It's so interesting.
I have some lovely people that I've worked with for 15, 20 years, and they were just a professional person who bought a property and then moved to London is a big one as well. So might own a property in Manchester. Moved down to London.
And they keep that as
especially flats. And then you've got the rise of Airbnb, which pulls them into that.
Of course, and that's a whole other thing as well. One thing I'd love to actually ask off the back of that is, I mean, I have close family of mine are also professional landlords, and that is their whole business. That is they're also they also have letting agencies, so they are so immersed in that world, and they've learned it. They've actually kind of trained in that world. They've learned the rules basically, and they've been in the industry for a long time. For people who have full-time jobs and busy lives and think that buying a property as an investment might be a good profitable thing for them to do, do you find that most people who do that are successful, or do you think often people underestimate kind of the hassle, the stress, the costs involved?
The latter.
Really,
your first time purchase. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday who's jumping from holiday lets into private residential for the first time, and he's got the added complexity of it being in Wales. So we were discussing that. But firstly, I'd say, how knowledgeable are you of the market? If you don't know anything about the market, then you need support and advice. And even if it's just for the first year or two. Just get someone in to do it for you, because that's what they do. That's their bread and butter. If they don't know what's coming down the line in regulation changes, then they're not a good agent. Most of them, we all know what we're doing. We're reading the emails every day. We're getting the updates from Arla, Property Mark, other professional organisations that we're all members of. We are able to provide a service to you that prevents you from falling into the perils of missing regulation and legislation because you didn't know it existed. And there are, what do we say, like more than 150 pieces of legislation that affect private residential rentals, and in any industry. That's a significant amount of knowledge you'll need that you acquire. Then there are like lots of really cool services online, which are just little checklists and tick, 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 do all these things and you're good to go. But you need the time afterwards as well. So I think there's a lot of landlords that get into the industry and think that the primary resource requirements that they'll have will be at the outset, the finding the tenants. And that's, honestly, today is if you put it down as a 24-hour process, it's a 5-minute job.
Okay.
So finding tenants now is not hard, and that's as a result of the fact that you've got so little stock available and so many people needing housing. So, for example, 3-4 years ago, the start of the tenant fee ban, actually, we would typically do 8 viewings for a let and rent properties in 10 to 14 days. Now you put it on 10 hours later, you have to take it off.
Wow.
Because you've just got so many, you just can't process all those viewing requests. So
what has caused that in your experience? Because there are various different things that there seem to be that are being tied to why there is such an issue at the moment in the last few months. But what have you seen as it?
I think there was a conversation maybe in PMQs earlier this week, and they talked about a loss of circa, I've got 160,000 in my head, I might be completely wrong with that, I should probably fact check it, but there's been a big drop in the number of rental properties that have been registered since 2016 to 2022. The main cause of that is highly likely to be people getting out because they can't afford it anymore. So it's more, I personally think that's more likely to be strategic landlords offsetting, getting rid of the losses in their portfolios.
Okay.
And accidental landlords finally exiting the market because they found the opportunity in the last 6 years. Couple that with COVID, big one. No one's moved, not really, for the last couple of years. That market buoyancy has not really come back the way that it was pre-COVID. Cost of living rises. Tenants are less likely to want to move to a new location, start a new relationship with a new landlord. You're familiar with the property you've got, you know what your costs are, you even if your rates are about to change on your gas and electricity, you've got a fair idea of how you can control it in a property you know. It's all unknown in a new property. So you've got that went on for a while, and then you've got people that are now in a position where they're like, we just need to move, and so unfortunately the stock isn't coming back on the market at the same levels. So we're not seeing an increase in first-time renters, which is the concerning element. You're seeing an increase in the number of renters that are wanting to move from property. And then they can't move from the property. So that's why you're not seeing the stock rising, because until they find a new property, their property's not going to come back on the market.
So it's almost, it's like a
chicken and egg.
Chicken and egg. And I mean, really, like looking in the next year or two, is there any chance it's going to change? Because it feels as though both in rental and in like the ownership market, people are putting their plans on the back burner to move. I know everyone I've spoken to that was thinking about it is like, I'm going to wait at least a year to think about moving again because of the uncertainty about the economy.
And mortgages. You do mortgages do have a big impact on the rental market, but actually less than the media would let you think it is. If you look at the media, it's all doom and gloom. And next year is going to be horrendous and worse than 2007, 2008. I mean, at the moment, what I'm seeing in our statistics, I am just looking at the rentals. I don't think that it is going to be quite as bad as we're all led to believe it is. And the interesting, my analysis that I think we need to focus a little bit more on is the number of dropouts from purchases and the number of dropouts from rentals, because that's actually what we're seeing the most of. So, and I always do this with the first-time buyer stuff. As soon as the first-time buyers start to drop out of the market, that's when you really know that there might be a problem coming.
Okay.
Because I think higher up the rung of the ladders, you're a bit more cushioned with those mortgage hikes. You'll find people that own properties where they've only got like 50% of a mortgage on it.
Yeah, that's
much more able to stomach those increases.
Course, yeah.
So they can still move, but they can only still move if the first-time buyers are entering down the rungs. So,
and sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say first-time buyers move from the rented sector.
Yes.
So if they're not,
if they're not moving from the rental sector, there's no properties available that they're moving from.
Yeah. So I don't think we'll see rental properties shrink more than they are. I don't think the PRS as a sector is shrinking quite as much as it's made out to be. I think the issue is that people can't move. People aren't moving. Yeah. So you're not seeing the recirculation of property in that sector that you would normally have done in previous years. So we do have a rental property crisis, but it's not because landlords are mass exiting the market. It's just not. I just don't see it. For as many as we've got saying are selling property, we've got the same number saying they're buying property.
Yeah.
So and that's because they're also more cushioned to the changes in mortgage interest rates because they tend to not need as high a mortgage because they've got bigger deposits. So, and this is the other thing that is a misconception when it comes to what landlords make out of property. A landlord might buy a property, and that will just use round numbers of £100,000, but they will have put £50,000 of their own money into that. And so when people say, well, your mortgage, people have banded ideas around about capping rents so that they're not higher than the mortgage payments. Well, okay, well, why don't we consider the £50,000 loan that the landlord's put into securing that property for you? Because if you want to point fingers at a sector that is affecting the ability for rental tenants to get into home ownership, then it's the financial sector, it's the mortgage industry that is the problem, because they're not offering, and they're limited in what they can do, mortgages to people that can pay those rates in rents. And so it's my dissertation in property law was on this subject. It was basically talking about how the change in the property sector will only come if the financial sector changes for it. So if the financial sector is able to offer mortgages to land property owners that want to make money from the asset, then the only way to combat that and curb those prices is to also have sufficient products offered to people that don't have that volume of cash, but are able to show that they can afford to pay those monthly payments. So
and we've got a crisis when it comes to affordability. So they're definitely not doing anything to address that at the moment. It's mad when you look at the stats of what people need to be earning to get a mortgage on a one-bedroom flat in like zone 4 of London,
and how much of their own income on a monthly basis they have to put away just to reach the criteria to even be considered for a mortgage. And then you're like, well, 90% if you can get one, great, but your interest rate is phenomenal, because it's just you're too risky according to the bank.
How are you meant to have a life?
And meanwhile, the cost of every single thing is going up. The cost of your rent's going up. The cost of your bills is going up. And actually, on that note, we've talked a lot about people being stuck and not able to move from a rented property. But there's also a scenario going on, which me and a lot of my friends experienced, particularly in London, because rents went up so much, of people being forced out.
Yeah, and there are some, and you know, like I said, some landlords are just, I mean, they're not wrong in doing what they're doing. A lot of them took a cut or a freeze during COVID. My put, and I, you know, we work with less than 1% of the entire market. It's not a huge number that we're talking about here, about 20,000 or so landlords. And we did a survey with them, and more than half of them at the start of COVID, before any of the measures came in, contacted the tenants to ask them how they were before furlough schemes, before mortgage relief and all of that. To say, if you can't pay, it's fine, just delay it and we'll work it out, or to instantly offer reductions in rents for periods of time that didn't have to be repaid or could be repaid over a longer period of time. And so you've got to look at the hit that they took during that 2 or 3 year period, and it's no different, I suppose, to the furlough scheme. We all know we have to repay it, you know. That's what all these tax cuts, tax increases and service cuts are about. And so a lot of them are, you know, I've got clients who haven't raised their rents for 4 years, but now, because they're raising their rents, it's a shocking number that you're getting.
That's another question I'd love to ask, which I hadn't thought of before, but it's something I come across a lot, is landlords don't seem to be very good at increasing their rents. So rather than, you know, I don't know, increasing the rent by 1%, 2%, 3% a year, it seems to be, you know, it'll be the same for years, and then there's a massive jump, and then a tenant's kind of furious and feels that they're hard done by, but they might actually have not seen any increase for 5 years or so. Do you think that should be changed? Because I do wonder whether landlords as standards should be just increasing rents gradually. You know, with inflation. I mean, I'm not asking all landlords to put
10%.
Yeah, 10%.
That's the thing, isn't
it's hard, but at least with, you know, with some sort of
it's
regular.
Not And these are the conversations we're having now. I mean,
I don't want to pay more rent. Don't get me wrong, but you know, if that is the way, I think I'd rather it step up gradually than have some false sense of security about what I'm paying, and then be hit with a, you know, your bill's going up by 50%.
Well, just again, there's 2 reasons why landlords are putting their properties rental prices up. One is their own costs have spiraled, and the second one is the messaging that's out there in the industry. It's like the media is just, everyone's putting their rents up, and then landlords are going, I've not put my rent up, maybe I need to put my rent up.
Of course, yeah.
And then it's like, oh, landlords, interest rates are going up, and oh, my interest rate going up, oh, I better go and check it.
It's really interesting actually that you say that, because I read something recently and it got a lot of criticism. I actually think it was on the radio I heard it, but it got a lot of criticism, but I do think there was an interesting point, which was a landlord basically saying, well, I don't really set my rates, the market sets them, and I've got estate agents telling me it's too cheap. Do you think that's true?
So there is an element of estate agents, but they're just doing their job, and I know that there is this we all like to think there's this little pretty picture of an estate agent, a landlord and a tenant all getting on with the house on fire. The estate agent is the intermediary, and the changes that the government made to the legislations meant that our direct line of who we work for is clearly now established in legislation. We are now working for the client as an estate agent, and so there's no longer any grey area about you providing services to the tenant. You're providing services to the tenant on behalf of your client, but your client is who you work for. You wouldn't really be doing your job very well if you didn't say to them, listen, your rents are this. And you have some estate agents that do that religiously every year because they get paid a renewal fee when they do a renewal with a tenant, so 2 to 3%. But then you've got 40% of the market that don't use an agent. So those 40% of landlords will probably consider, I don't want to increase the rent annually because I don't want to lose my tenant. I just want to keep my tenant. So we have loads of landlords that have got 10, 15-year tenancies. Yeah. And they've just not increased their rent. And then you're like, we don't want to have this conversation with this tenant now. But you know, they come to you and they say, can you do it for me? Because I'm, you know, and then you're like, well, that's how agents get bad reps, by the way. Because it's like, oh, she's transferred it to an agent. And the first thing they did is call me and say, right, your rent's going up. Well, they did that because the reason she transferred it to the agent is because she didn't want to have that difficult conversation with you.
Yeah, I get it. So that's why you guys are the bad guys.
But that's our job. So, and you have to have a thick skin if that's what you want to do for a living. Lettings and property management is the toughest job.
I can imagine, because I think one of the reasons why this is such a contentious topic is that I do think there's like a real emotional narrative element, reality to property and home. Massively, isn't there? It is something that people, I guess, forget a lot of the time. For a huge amount of the sector is a business. It's not a charity or a do-good. And I guess it comes down to fundamentally whether people believe that like owning your home is a right or a luxury, which I think, you know, everyone's going to have different views on. But it's such an interesting sector in that way, because I don't think there are any other sectors which have that conflict between like morality and business in the same way that much.
Yeah, it's such a fundamental need for an individual to feel a sense of safety and security over their home and where they live. But equally, it's such a fundamental need of a business owner to be profitable, like by definition.
It's such a... And again, this is coming back to my dissertation. And so
we'll have to publish it in the show notes.
I might actually get permission. The really good points that are raised, and it's one of the things that we've always as agents sold ourselves as with the intermediary, so that you don't have to deal with that emotional side of it. But then by the same token, there's so many landlords that are just like, they are really aware of the fact that their properties aren't theirs. And what's the funny thing is, legally speaking, as soon as you sign a tenancy agreement, that's not your property anymore. You just own the bricks. That's it. And you've got you are literally quiet enjoyment rights to the tenant, who then has the rights to use that property within, what is legal as they see fit. It's their home, and they should be encouraged to do that. And some of the legislative changes that are coming in, allowing pets.
That's great.
Yeah.
Letting people decorate.
I mean,
do it. It's fine. That's their home. Actually, I think there's an indication that people that want to decorate their properties will stay for longer.
I 100%. That's the sort of thing, and I'm sure it's just true for so many people, that really makes a difference to me as to whether to rent a property or not. Is how is it decorated, and if I could do that, then
no one wants magnolia.
I mean, absolutely not. No.
Do it in your own home, and that's it.
Unless you're 89.
Well, and it's that though, is it? And it's like we find that we go on about, we could talk about property all day, but most of the contentious issues at the end of a tenancy are things like garden. Actually, it's like weeding in the garden because people don't do it, or light bulbs. It's just silly little things. It's not really, or you didn't empty the bins properly, or you put the wrong recycling in the wrong bin, and now I've got to pay for a private company to come and collect it because the council won't do it. That sort of thing. And it's like, well, if people decorate properties and if people have pets in properties, and then it is their home, that's great. And the interesting thing about property law and land law in the UK is that we've the castle and the king kind of elements of what our legislation has been built all about time. And we've got, I think, one of the most interesting legal systems when it comes to property and land. And I fascinate. I love it. I love reading through titles and old historic papers and the old lease agreements and things like that. And it's like, I'm a bit weird, but
property law when I studied was not my favourite.
I absolutely loved it. I just like how it's so rooted in its history. And it's not really changed much. And there's like touches of various things that are really protective of the owner that you don't see in the European land transaction stuff and property transaction. And so it's fascinating for me when we talk about landlords and tenants, because they are at odds with the whole home ownership. That relationship completely disregards the fact that there is you as the homeowner. It's your castle and king, it's my property, but you literally relinquish all of your rights as soon as you sign a tenancy agreement with a tenant, and you give them all of the rights. And if we start to see rentals as a passing of rights from one person to the other, and then start to see the bricks and mortar of it as the business, then you can entirely see how you've got this emotional and business thing. And you don't the media and the government don't talk about the business side of things very
Well,
much.
they don't, and it's so interesting to hear you put it like that and frame it like that, particularly like you say in terms of thinking of it, which it obviously is legislatively as a passing on of rights. Because what's interesting, I mean, I've been there, you know, I've rented for years, and in the UK, and it's a bit crazy to hear you describe it in that way, because as a tenant, it doesn't feel that way. And I wonder if I've had good oh my god, good landlords and bad landlords, and I've you know, dealt with some agents who have been helpful and accommodating, and agents who have not been. And I wonder if it is just to do with the relationship of the person. But as a tenant, and I mean, it obviously depends where in the country you are as well, but I know in London, it's pretty common to move. You know, people move every year.
Not anymore.
Do they? No, not anymore.
I don't think so. I think people are staying for 2,
well,
3,
actually,
4.
that is true. But even so, you're right. But that's still, compared to like in the north, people will stay for still like a
4.6 years is the average.
Really?
Yeah. So if you exclude London,
Interesting.
If you exclude London, it's 4.6 years is the average tenancy length. Yeah.
What I wanted to ask is, because we see in other countries, people rent for life.
Yeah.
And
So they have different arrangements. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
The transfer of rights is totally different.
Do you think that we here should look at getting closer to that model? Because it could...
The only way you can answer that question is if you look at why people move. So the last survey I think we did on it is quite a few years ago now, so it will be outdated. We did look at some interesting COVID stuff around tenants to say what would make you move and things like that. But the majority of times that people move, well, one, the flexibility of rentals has been cited as a reason why people rent, because they can choose
I
to
think
move.
people do value flexibility more in the world we live in today,
Because
rather
you
than
can
times gone
test
by.
out a new area
Yeah, of
without
course.
having to commit to purchasing property. But then I suppose yes, basically, it should be an option is the short answer. There should definitely be an option for lifetime tenancies. But I know there's going to be landlords screaming, no, we don't want assured tenancies. But I think that it needs a lot of work.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a good understanding of how a landlord can manage that as a business, how they can exercise their rights when things go wrong, when the relationship falls foul and people, you need to recover possession. There needs to be a lot of work done. We have to switch back to the fact that the landlords have the power in the position. So I know we said transfer of rights, but they're the ones with the control and the power, and they're only being restricted by legislation and restrictions that have been brought in, and regulations and safety. And so the tenant is still the weaker party in that contract. And if you talk about that from consumer rights point of view, it is right that most of the legislative approaches have been taken to protect that weaker party.
Yeah.
And so if we gave lifetime tenancies, one, I think agents would be in uproar because then you have to go, well, you're not doing churn anymore. How are you going to make your money? But think about the influence that would have on the market as a whole. Agents then have to build relationships with tenants. And then actually, if agents aren't dealing with churn, can they spend more time working out how else to make money out of those services? And therefore, are we then able to sort of introduce new innovative markets into that market as subsectors? And so, I think resistance to change in the market is and the prop tech world is a big one for that. It's like the reason prop tech hasn't revolutionized the property industry as a whole is because there's just so little adoption of it, or it's piecemeal. Which is very reflective of the way that it's legislated as well. So, as a whole, there's just a combined piece around it, but you need everything to line up. So you need legislation to line up, you need regulation to line up. We need to stop being divisive in the conversations that we have and start cohesively talking about all of the stakeholders in this sector and how we can service them and make them work better. But then we also need to start talking about the options that we want to introduce and stop using headline grabbing things, because it just don't help. It's like Brexit 101 that being regurgitated in the property industry.
We don't learn our lesson, do we?
No.
It is so interesting because I'm going to say that again because we've used that word too many times.
Yeah.
I just think what is fascinating is, and you've covered a lot of the points there, but looking at, I've got friends that live in Spain and live in Germany where this whole system is much more set up for people to be tenants for 5, 10, 20 years, and it works, and people are happy. Rent isn't going up by 10% every year. People can't be kicked out at very short notice, and people aren't thinking in the same way that people here are obsessed with home ownership because of that security, I think, that maybe comes with a more robust rental sector or rental situation, I guess, for a lot of tenants.
And you hit the nail on the head there. It's straight away. It's that, like I said, what I find fascinating about the property and landlords in the UK is that it promotes that home ownership, and everyone should own a home. And actually owning a home, it cements you to a certain place. It restricts your ability to do certain things. And Europeans, we know, are not like that. The freedom of movement and the freedom to work wherever they want, and they're much more flexible with their lifestyles. They would, I think, be more inclined to say, I'm going to go and move to Germany, and I'm going to go and move to Italy, and I'm going to spend a year in Spain. And so home ownership for them, it's just not that big a deal, because as long as there's always property. And what is an interesting one is to talk to people that come here. So we do a lot more. And the way we know is the amount of right to rent checks we have to do. So because that's all now. That's a nice easy statistic you can just count up the number that you've done. It's a bigger market now. So they're always, and they were previously all fascinated, and you'll get a mix of the How to Rent guide, for example. They're the only demographic that read that guide.
Really?
Yeah.
Have you read it? Have you ever read that? No one reads it. And
you're right.
But they do. Because they're like, new country.
Yeah, of course, they do things right,
But you know what it does is it makes them panic. And they're like, oh my God, I don't know if I've done all these things right. And what about all these things? And you're just like talking to them, you're like, okay, let me just reassure you that all of that's already taken care of. And you'll find it here, here, and here.
Yeah.
Most people don't even read that guide. And it's like, but it has some useful information in there if you're new to the country. But we have conversations with them, and they're like, it's not like this at home, and I don't profess to know what it is like for them, but it is a direct symptom of the fact that in Europe and America, home ownership is just not that big a deal, because people move. I mean, if you talk to Americans, they'll move states across country and all of that, and it's like it's
like it's nothing.
It's a drop of a hat. I wouldn't even contemplate moving. I couldn't even dream of packing my house up now and moving across country and stuff. Not a chance. But we're just much more settled and rooted, I think, as our whole civilian setup is to be very close to family and friends, and we like what we know, don't we?
Yes, we do like the familiar.
We're anti-change, and that
anti-change.
We're definitely a bit,
as individuals and as an industry, by the sound of it.
Yes, we're a bit stuck in our ways. I mean, honestly, it's just so fascinating talking to you, and I wish we could talk to you I wish we could keep you here for another 2 hours. But just before we let you go, there's one more question that I really just want to ask you, which is, for people now who are thinking, and I'm talking about kind of young people in their 20s or 30s who are looking to build wealth and accumulate and are thinking about property as an investment. It's a totally different landscape than, say, 30 years ago, if it's 30 years ago, where you could kind of self-certify a mortgage, and we hadn't just seen this enormous boom in house prices. The cost of living's higher. It's just a completely different world, and it's much, much, much harder for people to make those property purchases, particularly if they've bought their first home, and that's wiping most people out, is just buying that first home. So for people who are now thinking about buying a property as a long-term investment, we've talked about kind of the all of the downsides of being a landlord that are lesser known, But obviously there is still upside as well, and I'd love to know, do you think it's still an attractive way of building wealth? Do you think it's still an attractive asset to own?
Yeah, it's not going to change. Yeah, it's a really short answer. I don't think I think people that get into property do so because they're interested in property, and that's where the passion comes in. They have a passion. There's lots of like little videos all over the place these days about, I bought this and I did it up and then I sold it, and it's like great. And flipping is another way of doing that sort of stuff. It's still, for me, it's the most interesting investment you can make. It's more hands-on, or it's as hands-on as you want to be. You're providing an end product. You actually then get to, in some cases, build a relationship with the user of that end product, which is your tenant. It has a long-term gain for you. You will appreciate property maintenance a lot more, and you'll get an eye for it, and it's always going to be like that. And I'd encourage anyone, if you're in your 20s, just any step into property as a world, just get your feet under a table somewhere and have a look and see what you think. But it is an increasingly difficult landscape to navigate on your own, so it's important that you partner with the right people and get the right support. And even home ownership, I'm not anti-home ownership. 15 million of our properties in the UK are homeowner occupied, and people should not be put off by the fact that they're being told in the media mortgages are really hard to come by and prices are going up. Everyone needs, it's an asset. It's something that we all need. It's housing is as important to us as water. It's that you've got to have that and make something a home. Don't be put off by it. There will always be ways to pay off that mortgage sooner, and people will work things out. And I think sometimes in tough times as well, you get the most interesting. If you put things under pressure, you get interesting stuff.
Sure, totally.
And that's, I think, over the next year or two, yes, there's probably going to be a lot of losses and a lot of difficulties and maybe even tragedies, down the line. But the flip side to that is that you will also get a lot of interesting things coming out of it. You'll get innovation, you'll get new products, new ways of doing things, and people have different conversations. Things move forward as long as people are willing to have those conversations and open up those doors. So that's definitely still, don't be put off. I'd still definitely do it, but of course take financial advice. No,
that's really, really interesting.
Thank you so much. It's been so interesting. There's been so many things we could talk about. We could be here for hours, but just for anyone that is interested in what you do, wants to find out more information, where can people find you?
They can pop over to letsmove.co.uk. It is a startup business, and it's just launching probably in the first quarter of next year. A product which will help everybody who has anything to do with property understand what their property is worth for them, how it's working. So from valuation tools right the way up to like storing important documentation and managing property as well, if that's what you do. So that's where you can go.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank
that
you.
was absolutely
so much.